15-year-old Madison Harper sat in the juvenile courtroom with a smile that turned every stomach in the room. She giggled quietly as the prosecutor read the charges. 2 counts of first-degree murder by poisoning. Her parents were dead, their bodies found in their own home, organs destroyed by a substance so toxic it left investigators stunned. The girl who should have been grieving was grinning instead. She leaned toward her attorney and whispered something that made him stiffen. One juror looked away in disgust. Another gripped the edge of the bench. Madison didn't seem to notice or care. She thought her age would protect her. She thought the system would go easy. But the judge sitting at the front of that courtroom had already seen enough. And the evidence hidden in her phone, her search history, and a single cash receipt was about to destroy every bit of confidence she'd ever had. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began. It started in a small suburban home where a mother and father trusted their daughter completely. They never imagined that trust would be the last mistake they ever made. The night they died, the house smelled like dinner. The table was set. The drinks were poured. Everything looked normal. But beneath that surface, something cold and calculated was already in motion. Madison had spent weeks planning it. She had researched the substance. She had practiced her expressions in the mirror. She had prepared herself to watch them suffer and do nothing. And when the paramedics finally arrived, racing through the front door with equipment and urgency, she stood in the hallway with her arms crossed and her face blank. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just watched. The investigators didn't know it yet, but they were standing 3 feet away from a killer who believed she was untouchable. The courtroom was silent in the way that only tragedy can make a room silent. Every seat was filled. Families sat shoulder to shoulder with reporters who scribbled notes with shaking hands. The air was thick with something unspoken, something heavy that pressed down on everyone who entered. This was not a trial anyone wanted to witness, but it was a trial everyone needed to see. At the center of it all sat Madison Harper, 15 years old, dressed in a pale blue sweater that her public defender had chosen to make her look younger, softer, more sympathetic. It wasn't working. Her eyes were sharp and alert. Her posture was relaxed. She looked around the room like she was attending a school assembly, not a murder trial. And when the bailiff asked everyone to rise for the judge, Madison stood slowly, almost lazily, as if the whole proceeding bored her. The judge entered with the weight of decades behind him. His face was lined and serious, his movements deliberate. He had presided over hundreds of cases, seen countless defendants, heard every excuse and every lie. But even he paused for a fraction of a second when his eyes landed on Madison. She was staring right back at him, not with fear, not with shame, with curiosity, maybe even amusement. The judge sat down and gestured for everyone else to do the same. The room settled into an uneasy quiet. Papers rustled. Someone coughed. A mother in the back row wiped her eyes with a tissue that had already been used too many times. And then the prosecutor stood. His voice was steady but cold. He didn't need to add drama. The facts were damning enough on their own. He began by stating the names of the deceased: Richard Harper, Angela Harper, a father and a mother, both found unresponsive in their home on a quiet Tuesday evening in late September. Both transported to the hospital with symptoms of acute poisoning. Both declared dead within hours of arrival. The cause of death was organ failure brought on by ingestion of a restricted industrial toxin. The prosecutor paused and let that word hang in the air. Toxin. Not accident. Not illness. Poison. Deliberate. Calculated. Deadly. He turned toward the defense table and looked directly at Madison. She tilted her head slightly, as if she were trying to figure out a puzzle. Then, unbelievably, she smiled. It was small. It was quick. But it was there, and everyone saw it. A juror in the second row visibly flinched. Another crossed her arms and looked down at her lap. The prosecutor continued, his tone sharper now. He explained that the toxin had been introduced into the family's evening meal. It had been mixed into drinks that the defendant herself had prepared and served. The parents had trusted her completely. They had no reason not to. She was their daughter. She lived under their roof. She ate at their table. And she had handed them cups filled with poison and watched them drink. The room seemed to contract. People stopped shifting in their seats. No one coughed. No one moved. The only sound was the prosecutor's voice, steady and relentless, building a picture that no one wanted to see but couldn't look away from. Madison leaned toward her attorney and whispered something. He stiffened and shook his head quickly, his jaw tight. She pulled back and shrugged, a faint smile still playing at the corners of her mouth. It was the kind of smile that didn't belong in a courtroom. It was the kind of smile that made people wonder what was broken inside her. One of the victim advocate coordinators seated near the family section pressed a hand to her mouth. A detective sitting in the gallery narrowed his eyes and made a note on the pad in front of him. This was not nervousness. This was not shock. This was something else entirely. This was someone who thought she was winning. The prosecutor moved on to the investigation. He explained that at first, authorities had considered the deaths accidental: food contamination, environmental exposure, a tragic and unexplainable double fatality. But the medical examiner had flagged something unusual in the toxicology reports. The substance found in both victims was not something that occurred naturally. It was not something that could be ingested by mistake. It required intent. It required access. And it required someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Investigators had retraced every step of that final evening. They had examined every inch of the house, and slowly, methodically, the evidence had pointed in one direction, toward the only person in that house who hadn't gotten sick, toward the only person who had shown no emotion when her parents stopped breathing, toward Madison Harper. The judge leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the girl at the defense table. She met his gaze without flinching. For a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Then the prosecutor said the words that made it all real. He said that the state would prove beyond any doubt that Madison Harper had researched the poison, that she had acquired it, that she had planned a crime for weeks, that she had carried it out with chilling precision, and that she had smiled while doing it. The room erupted in whispers. The judge raised a hand, and silence fell again. But the damage was done. The image was planted. A 15-year-old girl who had poisoned her own parents and laughed about it. And now, finally, she was going to face the consequences. Madison's smile faltered for just a second. It was barely noticeable. A flicker, a crack. But it was there. And the judge saw it. He removed his glasses slowly and set them on the bench in front of him. Then he spoke for the first time since entering the room. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that made everyone sit up straighter. He told Madison that this courtroom was not a stage, that her behavior was being observed and recorded, that the gravity of what she was accused of demanded respect, not mockery. She blinked once, twice, the smile disappeared. And for the first time since the trial began, Madison Harper looked like what she really was. A child who had made a choice so dark, so final, that there was no way back. The gavel had not yet fallen, but justice was already in motion. Richard and Angela Harper were the kind of people who never made headlines. They lived quietly in a modest 2-story home on a street lined with oak trees and mailboxes that all looked the same. Richard worked as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company. Angela was a part-time administrative assistant at a dental office. They weren't wealthy, but they were stable. They paid their bills on time. They mowed their lawn every Saturday. They waved to their neighbors and remembered birthdays. Their lives were built on routine and predictability, and they liked it that way. They had one daughter, Madison, and for 15 years they had done everything they could to give her a good life. They had no idea that she saw their love as control, their care as confinement, their presence as an obstacle. My neighbors remembered the Harpers as kind and unassuming. The couple next door, the Lewises, recalled seeing Richard outside on weekends washing his car or trimming hedges. Angela often walked their small dog in the evenings, always smiling and asking about other people's days. They were the kind of couple who brought cookies to block parties and offered to water plants when someone went on vacation. No one ever heard shouting from their house. No one ever saw police cars in the driveway. There were no signs of dysfunction, no red flags that anyone could point to later and say they should have known. The Harpers were ordinary in the best possible way. And that ordinariness made what happened to them even more incomprehensible. Inside the home, life moved with quiet rhythm. Dinner was served at 6:30 most nights. The television stayed on low volume in the living room. Homework was done at the kitchen table under Angela's watchful eye. Richard liked to read before bed, usually mysteries or historical nonfiction. Angela kept a small garden in the backyard where she grew tomatoes and basil. Madison had her own room upstairs, painted lavender at a request when she was 12. It was filled with books, a laptop, posters of bands she claimed to like but never really listened to. From the outside, it looked like a teenager's safe and comfortable space, but it was also where she spent hours researching things her parents would never have imagined, things that would eventually kill them. Richard and Angela were involved parents, but not overbearing. They set rules, but they weren't unreasonable. Madison had a curfew. She was expected to keep her grades up. She wasn't allowed unsupervised access to certain websites or social media platforms until she turned 16. These were standard boundaries, the kind that most parents set without thinking twice. But Madison didn't see them as protection. She saw them as prison bars. She resented being told when to come home. She hated being asked where she was going and who she was with. She despised the idea that anyone had authority over her. And slowly, over months and maybe even years, that resentment hardened into something darker. something cold, something dangerous. Teachers at Madison School described her as bright and articulate. She earned good grades without much visible effort. She participated in class when called on, but rarely volunteered. She had a small circle of friends, though none of them seemed particularly close to her. One teacher recalled that Madison always seemed older than her peers, more composed, more controlled. She didn't giggle in the hallways or pass notes during lectures. She observed. She calculated. She kept herself at a distance. Another teacher mentioned that Madison once turned in an essay about freedom that had unsettled him. It wasn't violent or explicit. It was just cold, clinical. It talked about autonomy as if it were the only thing that mattered, as if other people were inconveniences to be managed or removed. Angela had once joked to a coworker that Madison was too smart for her own good. She said it with a laugh, the way parents do when they're both proud and slightly unnerved by their child's intelligence. Angela admitted that sometimes she didn't know what Madison was thinking, that her daughter could be distant and hard to read. But she never suspected cruelty. She never imagined hatred. She thought Madison was just going through a phase, the kind of teenage detachment that eventually fades. Richard felt the same way. He told a friend at work that Madison was independent and strong-willed, and that those were good qualities. He said she'd go far in life. He said he was proud of her. He had no idea that his daughter was already planning a life that didn't include him. The house still smelled like the last dinner they ever shared. Investigators would later walk through those rooms and catalog everything. The half-empty box of pasta in the pantry, the coffee mugs in the sink. On the framed photos on the mantel, showing a family that smiled for the camera but never quite looked comfortable. There was a calendar on the refrigerator with Angela's handwriting, marking doctor's appointments and work shifts. There was a birthday card on the counter that Richard had bought for his sister but never got the chance to mail. There were signs of life everywhere, small, quiet, ordinary signs, and none of them suggested that this was a house where murder had been planned and executed with patience and precision. Angela's last text message was to a friend. It said she was making spaghetti for dinner and that Madison had offered to help. She added a smiley face. She said it was nice to spend time together. That message was sent at 5:47 in the evening. By midnight, Angela was dead. Richard died 20 minutes after her, and Madison sat in a hospital waiting room with a blanket around her shoulders, staring at the wall with dry eyes and an expression that nurses would later describe as unsettling. She never asked if her parents were okay. She never cried. She never screamed. She just sat there, calm and still, as if she were waiting for a bus. The parents who had loved her, provided for her, and trusted her completely were gone, and the girl they had raised had made sure of it. September 23rd started like any other Tuesday. Richard left for work at 7 in the morning, his travel mug filled with coffee, and his lunch packed in a small cooler. Angela drove Madison to school before heading to her own job at the dental office. The day was uneventful, ordinary, forgettable. Richard came home around 5:30, loosened his tie, and asked what was for dinner. Angela said spaghetti. Madison, who had been unusually quiet that afternoon, offered to help. Angela smiled and said that would be lovely. She handed her daughter a wooden spoon and asked her to stir the sauce while she boiled the pasta. Richard turned on the television in the living room and settled into his usual spot on the couch. Everything felt normal, routine, safe. But in the kitchen, something invisible and irreversible was already being set into motion. Madison moved through the kitchen with deliberate calm. She filled 3 glasses with iced tea from the pitcher in the refrigerator. She set them on the counter near the stove. Angela was busy draining pasta, steam rising in clouds around her face. Richard called from the living room, asking if dinner would be ready soon. Angela called back that it would be just a few more minutes. Madison reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out a small vial. It was no bigger than a lip gloss tube. The liquid inside was clear and odorless. She had researched it carefully. She knew how much was needed. She knew how long it would take. And she knew it couldn't be detected by taste or smell. She unscrewed the cap with steady fingers and tilted the vial over 2 of the glasses. The liquid mixed seamlessly with the tea. No cloudiness, no residue, no evidence. She put the vial back in her pocket and stirred each glass with a spoon. Then she carried them to the table. Dinner was served at 6:15. Angela brought the plates to the table while Richard washed his hands in the kitchen sink. Madison sat down first, her own glass of tea in front of her, the one she hadn't touched. Angela and Richard took their seats and picked up their forks. They talked about their days. Richard mentioned a problem with a shipment delay. Angela laughed about a patient who had tried to schedule 6 appointments in 1 week. Madison stayed quiet, pushing pasta around her plate and taking small sips from her glass. She watched her parents drink. Angela finished half her tea before the food was even gone. Richard drained his glass and asked if there was more. Madison got up without a word, refilled his glass from the pitcher, and sat back down. He thanked her, she nodded, and the meal continued. 20 minutes passed before the first symptom appeared. Richard paused mid-sentence and pressed a hand to his stomach. He frowned and said he felt off. Angela asked if the sauce was too rich. He shook his head and said it wasn't that. He said it felt like something was sitting heavy in his chest. Angela set down her fork and said she felt it too. A tightness, a pressure. She suggested it might be stress, or maybe they were both coming down with something. Madison offered to clear the table. She stood and gathered the plates, scraping the leftovers into the trash, while her parents sat in the dining room trying to make sense of what they were feeling. Richard loosened his collar. Angela rubbed her temples. Neither of them was alarmed yet. Discomfort wasn't the same as danger, not in their minds. Not yet. By 7 o'clock, Richard was on the couch, pale and sweating. Angela sat beside him, her breathing shallow and uneven. She said maybe they should call someone. Richard said to wait a little longer, that it might pass. Madison stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, her arms crossed, her face blank. She asked if they needed water. Angela nodded weakly. Madison brought 2 glasses and set them on the coffee table. She didn't sit with them. She didn't ask questions. She just stood there and watched. Richard tried to drink, but his hands were shaking. The glass slipped and water spilled onto the carpet. He apologized. Angela reached for him, but her arm felt too heavy. She looked at Madison and tried to say something, but the words came out slurred and confused. Panic was starting to creep in now. the kind of panic that comes when the body knows something is deeply, terribly wrong. At 7:32, Richard collapsed. He slid off the couch and hit the floor with a dull thud. Angela screamed his name and tried to get to him. Yeah, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She fell forward onto her knees, gasping and choking. Madison walked calmly to the kitchen and picked up the phone. She dialed 911. Her voice was steady when the operator answered. She said her parents were sick. She said they had eaten dinner and now they couldn't breathe. She said she didn't know what was wrong. The operator asked if they were conscious. Madison looked into the living room where her father lay motionless and her mother was clawing at the carpet, trying to drag herself toward him. Madison said she wasn't sure. The operator told her to stay on the line. Madison said, "Okay." Then she set the phone down on the counter and walked to the front door. She unlocked it so the paramedics could get in. Then she sat down on the stairs and waited. The ambulance arrived 8 minutes later. Some paramedics rushed inside with equipment and urgency. They found Richard unresponsive on the living room floor. They found Angela barely breathing, her lips turning blue. They worked fast, starting chest compressions, inserting airways, shouting instructions to each other. Madison stood in the hallway and watched. One paramedic asked her what had happened. She said they ate dinner and then got sick. He asked what they ate. She said spaghetti. He asked if she ate it too. She said yes. He looked her up and down. She was fine. Completely fine. He asked if anyone else was in the house. She said no. He told her to grab a jacket because she'd need to come with them. She went upstairs, came back with a hoodie, and followed them out to the ambulance without a word, without tears, without anything. Richard Harper was pronounced dead at 8:51 that evening. Angela Harper followed at 9:12. The doctors tried everything. They pumped their stomachs. They flooded their systems with fluids and medications. But the poison had already done its work. Their organs were shutting down. Their bodies were failing. There was nothing left to save. In the waiting room, a nurse approached Madison with the news. She sat the girl down gently and told her that her parents were gone. Madison looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. The nurse asked if there was someone she could call. Madison said she had an aunt in another state. The nurse asked if she wanted to see her parents one last time. Madison shook her head. She said she wanted to go home. The nurse didn't know what to say to that. So she just sat there beside a girl who had lost everything and felt nothing. And somewhere deep in the back of her mind, a small alarm began to ring. The first officers to respond treated the Harper house as a medical emergency, not a crime scene. There was no forced entry, no signs of struggle, no blood or weapons or broken glass. It looked like a family home where something tragic and inexplicable had happened. The living room was still lit. The television was on, volume low, playing a sitcom that no one had been watching. Plates sat in the kitchen sink. A pot of spaghetti sauce was still on the stove, cooled and congealed. The dining table held 3 placemats and 3 glasses, 2 of them empty, 1 still half full. Everything appeared normal, painfully, disturbingly normal. But 2 people were dead, and the only survivor was a 15-year-old girl who hadn't shed a single tear. Detective Ray Callahan arrived just after midnight. He was a 22-year veteran of the department, a man who had seen overdoses and heart attacks and carbon monoxide poisonings that wiped out entire families. He had worked cases where grief was loud and messy and expected. But when he walked into the Harper home and saw how untouched everything was, how calm and orderly, something in his gut told him this wasn't just a tragedy. This was something else. He stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at the spot where Richard Harper had collapsed. There was an indentation in the carpet, a water stain from the glass he had dropped, a pillow from the couch lying on the floor. Callahan crouched down and ran his gloved hand over the area. Nothing seemed out of place. But that was the problem. Nothing seemed out of place. The medical examiner had already flagged the case as suspicious. Both victims had presented with nearly identical symptoms: rapid onset, severe gastrointestinal distress, respiratory failure, multi-organ collapse. It wasn't food poisoning. It wasn't a virus. It wasn't anything natural. The toxicology reports wouldn't be back for days, but the examiner had seen enough to know that something foreign and lethal had been introduced into their systems. She had called Callahan herself and told him to treat the house as a potential crime scene. So he did. He called in a forensic team. He had the kitchen sealed off. He ordered photographs of every room, every surface, every item that might tell a story. And then he asked to speak with the daughter. Madison was brought back to the house just after 1 in the morning. A victim advocate sat beside her in the back of a patrol car. The advocate later reported that Madison had been polite and cooperative, but emotionally flat. She hadn't asked questions. She hadn't cried. She had stared out the window during the entire ride and said nothing unless spoken to. When they pulled into the driveway and Madison saw the police tape and the lights and the people moving in and out of her house, she didn't react. She just unbuckled her seatbelt and waited to be told what to do. The advocate found it unnerving. She had worked with trauma victims for over a decade. She knew that shock could look like numbness, but this felt different. This felt like absence. Callahan met Madison in the driveway. He introduced himself gently. He kept his voice calm and even. He told her he was very sorry for her loss. She thanked him in a voice that sounded rehearsed. He asked if she was feeling okay, if she needed water or a place to sit. She said she was fine. He asked if she would be willing to answer a few questions. She said yes. They sat on the front steps of the house while forensic investigators moved past them, carrying evidence bags and cameras. Callahan asked Madison to walk him through the evening. She did so with impressive clarity. She described dinner, the spaghetti, the tea, the conversation. She said her parents had started feeling sick around 7. She said she had called 911 as soon as she realized it was serious. Her timeline was precise, her details were consistent, and her tone never wavered. Callahan asked if anyone else had been in the house that day. Madison said no. He asked if her parents had eaten anything earlier that she hadn't. She said she didn't think so. He asked if they had any known allergies or medical conditions. She said her dad had high cholesterol, but that was it. He asked if there had been any arguments recently, any tension in the home. She paused for just a moment, then said no. Everything had been normal. Callahan watched her face carefully. She met his eyes without hesitation. She didn't fidget. She didn't look away. She didn't display any of the nervous tics that most people showed when being questioned by police. She was calm, controlled, almost too controlled. He thanked her for her time and told her she'd be staying with a family friend until relatives could be contacted. She nodded and stood up. As she walked toward the advocate's car, Callahan made a note in his notebook. One word: detached. Inside the house, the forensic team was already finding things that didn't add up. The contents of the refrigerator were photographed and cataloged. The trash was examined. The glasses from the dining table were carefully bagged and labeled. One of the techs noticed that 2 of the glasses had residue at the bottom. The third, the one that had been half full, did not. That glass was clean. It had only contained tea. The other 2 had something else, something that would need to be tested. Another tech was going through the kitchen cabinets, checking for cleaning supplies, medications, anything that could have been ingested accidentally. Everything was ordinary. Dish soap, vitamins, ibuprofen. Nothing toxic, nothing lethal. Which meant whatever had ended up in those glasses hadn't come from the house. It had been brought in. Callahan walked through the house slowly, taking in every detail. He stood in the kitchen and imagined the evening as Madison had described it. Dinner being prepared. The family sitting down together. Everything normal. But somewhere in that sequence, something had gone wrong. Someone had introduced a substance that killed 2 people within hours. And the only person in the house who hadn't gotten sick was the one person who had survived. That didn't prove anything. Not yet. But it was a fact that couldn't be ignored. Callahan opened the trash can and looked inside. Coffee grounds, a banana peel, an empty yogurt container. He moved things aside carefully, and then he saw it. A crumpled receipt from a hardware store. Dated 3 days earlier. It was for a cash purchase. No name, just a timestamp and a list of items. One of them had been circled by hand. Callahan pulled the receipt out with gloved fingers and held it up to the light. The circled item was a pest control product. Industrial grade, restricted sale. It required ID or proof of professional use to purchase. Callahan's jaw tightened. He bagged the receipt and called over one of the techs. He told him to check the rest of the trash, to check the garage, to check Madison's room. He wanted to know if there was anything else in this house that didn't belong. The tech nodded and got to work. Callahan stood in the kitchen and looked at the 3 glasses sitting on the counter in evidence bags. 2 people were dead. 1 girl was untouched. And a receipt for industrial poison had been thrown away like it was nothing. The pieces weren't fully together yet, but they were starting to form a picture that made his stomach turn. He walked outside and found the victim advocate standing by her car. He asked where Madison was. The advocate said she was inside the car, waiting. Callahan looked through the window. Madison was staring straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap, her expression blank. He asked the advocate how the girl had been acting. The advocate hesitated, then said honestly that she seemed fine. Too fine. Callahan nodded slowly. He told the advocate to take her to the temporary placement, but to stay close. He said there would be more questions soon. The advocate understood. She got into the car and drove away. Callahan watched the taillights disappear down the street. Then he pulled out his notebook and circled one name in red ink. Madison Harper. The only person in that house who had walked away unharmed. and the only person who had a reason to want her parents gone. The toxicology report came back 4 days after Richard and Angela Harper were pronounced dead. The medical examiner called Detective Callahan personally, her voice tight with a mix of urgency and disbelief. She told him that both victims had been poisoned with a compound called methomyl, a restricted carbamate pesticide used primarily in industrial agriculture. It was not something found in household products. It was not something available at a regular garden center. It was highly toxic, fast-acting, and designed to eliminate pests by shutting down their nervous systems. In humans, it caused the same catastrophic failure: respiratory collapse, organ shutdown, death within hours if the dose was high enough, and the doses found in Richard and Angela Harper were more than high enough. They had been given a lethal amount, deliberately, precisely, fatally. Callahan sat at his desk with the report in front of him and felt the weight of what he was reading settle into his bones. This was not an accident. This was not a mistake. Someone had acquired a restricted industrial poison, introduced it into a family meal, and watched 2 people die. The only question now was who. But Callahan already had a theory. He had the receipt from the trash. He had the clean glass that Madison had used. He had her behavior at the scene, her lack of emotion, her eerie calm. Now he needed proof. He needed to connect her to the poison. He needed to show that she had access, opportunity, and intent. And that meant tracing the purchase back to its source. The receipt had been found crumpled at the bottom of the kitchen trash, but it was still legible. It showed a cash transaction at a hardware and farm supply store located 20 minutes outside of town. The purchase had been made 3 days before the deaths. The items listed included work gloves, a small hand trowel, and a container of methomyl concentrate. The total was $38.17. No name was attached to the transaction, no credit card trail, just cash, a timestamp, and a store location. Callahan drove out to the store the next morning with a forensic tech and a warrant for their surveillance footage. The manager, a man in his 60s with grease-stained hands and a wary expression, led them to a back office where the security system was kept. The footage was grainy but functional. Callahan scrolled through the timestamp on the receipt and found the corresponding moment on the video. A figure entered the store wearing a dark hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. The hood was pulled up, obscuring most of the face. The figure moved quickly through the aisles, picking up items without hesitation. No browsing, no confusion. This person knew exactly what they were looking for. They grabbed the gloves and the trowel first, then walked to a locked cabinet near the back of the store. They waited until an employee approached. The employee unlocked the cabinet and pulled out a small container. There was a brief exchange. The employee asked a question. The hooded figure nodded and handed over cash. The transaction took less than 2 minutes. Then the figure walked out. Callahan replayed the footage 3 times. He zoomed in as much as the system allowed. The face was still obscured, but the build was visible. Slim, average height. The gait was deliberate, but not rushed. He asked the manager if the employee who had processed the sale was working that day. The manager checked the schedule and said yes. Callahan found the employee stocking shelves near the front of the store. The young man, no older than 20, looked nervous the moment he saw the badge. Callahan kept his tone even and asked if he remembered selling methomyl to anyone recently. The employee nodded immediately. He said yeah, he remembered because the buyer had seemed young. He said he'd asked for ID, but the person had said they were purchasing it for a parent who ran a small farm. He said it wasn't unusual. People did that all the time. Callahan asked what the buyer had looked like. The employee hesitated, then said honestly that he couldn't remember much. The hoodie had covered most of their face, but he thought it was a girl, maybe a teenager. He said she hadn't said much, just handed over the money and left. Callahan asked if she had signed anything or provided any identification. The employee shook his head and said no, that the store's policy only required ID for bulk purchases or certain quantities. A single small container didn't trigger that requirement. It was a loophole, a gap in the system, and someone had known exactly how to exploit it. Callahan thanked the employee and walked back to his car with the footage copied onto a thumb drive. He had a hooded figure. He had a timeline. Now he needed to connect that figure to Madison Harper. Back at the station, Callahan handed the footage over to a forensic analyst who specialized in gait analysis. The analyst studied the way the figure walked, the length of their stride, the angle of their shoulders, the way they shifted their weight. Then Callahan provided comparison footage. School security camera recordings of Madison walking through the hallways at her high school. Footage from a grocery store near the Harper home where Angela had taken Madison shopping 2 weeks earlier. The analyst ran the comparisons and came back with a report. The gait matched. The stride length was consistent. The posture was nearly identical. It wasn't definitive proof that would hold up in court on its own, but it was enough to establish probable cause, enough to justify the next step. Callahan drafted a warrant to search Madison Harper's room, her belongings, and her electronics. The search was executed early on a Friday morning. Madison was staying with a family friend, a woman named Carol who had known the Harpers for years. Carol was cooperative but visibly shaken. She had welcomed Madison into her home out of compassion and couldn't fathom that the quiet girl sleeping in her guest room might be responsible for her parents' deaths. Callahan and his team moved through Madison's temporary space first, checking drawers and bags, finding nothing. Then they drove to the Harper house, still sealed as a crime scene, and went upstairs to Madison's bedroom. It looked like any teenager's room. Books stacked on a desk, clothes folded in a dresser, a laptop sitting closed on a nightstand. Callahan pulled on gloves and opened the laptop. It was password protected. He bagged it and tagged it for the digital forensics team. Then he opened the closet. Hanging in the back, behind a row of jackets and sweaters, was a dark hoodie. Callahan pulled it out carefully. It matched the one in the surveillance footage. Same color, same style. He checked the pockets. Empty. But that didn't mean it was clean. He bagged it and sent it to the lab for trace analysis. If Madison had handled the methomyl container while wearing that hoodie, there might be residue. Microscopic particles, chemical traces that couldn't be washed away completely. It was a long shot, but it was worth checking. Callahan moved to the desk next. He opened drawers and found notebooks, pens, old assignments. Then he found something else. Tucked between two notebooks was a folded piece of paper. He opened it carefully. It was a handwritten list. Dosage amounts, symptoms, time to onset, detection methods, all written in Madison's neat, controlled handwriting. Callahan's chest tightened. This wasn't research for a school project. This was a blueprint, a plan. He photographed the paper and bagged it as evidence. Then he kept searching. In the bottom drawer of the desk, beneath a stack of old magazines, he found a small glass vial. It was empty, but there was a faint residue at the bottom. Callahan sealed it immediately and labeled it for testing. If that residue matched the methymal found in the victims, the case would be airtight. He stood in the middle of Madison's room and looked around. Everything was so orderly, so controlled, so carefully maintained. This was the room of someone who planned, someone who thought ahead, someone who believed they were smarter than everyone else. The forensic results came back within a week. The vial contained trace amounts of methomyl. The hoodie had microscopic particles consistent with pesticide exposure. The handwritten notes matched known toxic profiles for carbamate poisoning. And the gait analysis confirmed that the figure in the surveillance footage matched Madison Harper's movements with a high degree of certainty. Callahan compiled the evidence into a file and presented it to the district attorney. The DA read through it in silence, her expression growing darker with each page. When she finished, she looked up at Callahan and said one word: "Arrest her." 2 days later, Madison Harper was taken into custody. She was read her rights in the living room of Carol's house. She didn't resist. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She just stood up, held out her wrists, and smiled. Madison Harper's phone was seized the moment she was taken into custody. It was a standard iPhone with a cracked screen protector and a purple case covered in stickers. To anyone else, it looked like the phone of a normal teenager. But to the digital forensics team that began combing through it the following morning, it was a window into a mind that had been planning murder for weeks. The phone was locked with a 6-digit passcode, but a court order and the right software bypassed that within hours. What they found inside was damning. Text messages, search histories, notes, photos. All of it painted a picture of a girl who had not only planned to end her parents' lives, but had documented nearly every step of the process with chilling casualness. The text messages were the first breakthrough. Madison had a small circle of contacts, mostly classmates she barely spoke to, and a few family members she ignored. But there was one conversation that stood out. A thread with a girl named Lily Chen, a classmate Madison sat next to in biology. The messages stretched back over 2 months, and while most of them were mundane complaints about school and homework, there were moments where Madison's tone shifted into something darker. In early September, just 3 weeks before her parents died, Madison had sent a message that made the forensic analyst pause mid-scroll. It read, "I won't have to deal with them much longer." Lily had responded with a confused emoji. Madison had followed up with, "You'll see." There were more messages like that, vague, ominous, carefully worded to avoid outright confession, but impossible to interpret as anything innocent once you knew what had happened. On September 10th, Madison had texted Lily, "Do you ever feel like people are just in your way?" Lily had replied, asking if she meant her parents. Madison had responded, "Yeah, they think they own me." Lily had sent back something sympathetic, something most teenagers would say without thinking. "Parents are the worst sometimes." Madison had replied, Not for much longer. Lily hadn't responded to that one. Maybe she didn't know what to say. Maybe she thought Madison was just venting. But those words, a sitting in a thread time-stamped weeks before 2 people were poisoned, carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Detective Callahan reviewed the messages himself and felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't just intent. This was premeditation. Madison had been thinking about this for weeks, maybe longer, and she had been arrogant enough to hint at it in writing. He kept reading. On September 18th, 5 days before the murders, Madison had sent another message to Lily. This one was more direct. It said, "What would you do if you could just start over, like completely clean slate, no one telling you what to do?" Lily had replied, "I'd probably move somewhere warm and all." Why? Madison had written back, "Just thinking." Then, 2 days later, she had sent one final message to Lily that now felt like a confession in disguise. It read, "Freedom is closer than I thought." The messages to Lily were damning, but they were only part of the story. The forensic team moved on to Madison's search history. What they found was a meticulous record of research that spanned over 3 weeks. The searches had started in late August. At first, they were vague. How to make someone sick without them knowing. Undetectable poisons. Symptoms of food poisoning versus chemical poisoning. Then they became more specific. Methomyl toxicity in humans. How long does methomyl take to work? Can methomyl be detected in autopsy? Madison had spent hours reading medical journals, toxicology reports, and forum threads where people discussed pesticide exposure. She had educated herself thoroughly. She had learned exactly what she needed to know. The search history also showed that Madison had looked up legal consequences. She had searched, can a minor be tried as an adult for murder? Juvenile sentencing for homicide. What happens if you're under 16 and convicted? She had been calculating her risks. She had believed her age would protect her, that even if she got caught, the system would go easy on her. That belief had made her confident, reckless, arrogant. She had searched for hardware stores in the area. She had looked up how to purchase restricted chemicals without ID. She had even watched YouTube videos on how to avoid leaving fingerprints. Every search was a breadcrumb. Every query was another nail in her own coffin. But the most chilling piece of evidence wasn't in her search history or her messages. It was in her Notes app. Madison had created a note titled simply, "Plan." It had been started on September 2nd, 3 weeks before her parents died. The note was written in bullet points, clinical and detached, as if she were outlining a school project. The first line read, "Acquire substance, cash only, no trail." The second, "Test dosage amount, check online sources for lethal range." The third, "Choose timing, dinner, both present, no interruptions." The list went on. "Prepare drinks separately, serve without suspicion. Wait for symptoms, call emergency services only when necessary. Act confused, stay calm, cry if needed." That last line had been underlined twice, "cry if needed," as if emotion were a tool, a performance, something to be deployed strategically. Callahan read that note 3 times. Each time it felt worse. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a teenager lashing out in a moment of anger or pain. This was cold, calculated, methodical. Madison had planned every detail. She had anticipated every step. and she had written it all down because she believed she was too smart to get caught. The forensic team also found a draft of another note, one that had been deleted but was recoverable from the phone's memory. It was titled Freedom. The note was short, just a few lines. It read, "No more rules, no more questions, no more being controlled. I'll finally be able to live the way I want. They won't be able to stop me anymore." It was dated September 21st, 2 days before the murders. There were also photos. Madison had taken a picture of the receipt from the hardware store before throwing it away. She had photographed the vial of methomyl sitting on her desk. She had even taken a selfie in the hoodie she wore to the store, the hood pulled up, her face half hidden. These weren't accidental images. They were trophies, proof of what she had done, evidence of her own intelligence and planning. She had kept them on her phone like souvenirs, never imagining that anyone would ever see them. But now they were being printed, cataloged, and prepared for presentation in court. Every image, every word, every search, all of it would be used to show a jury exactly who Madison Harper was and what she had done. When Callahan presented the phone evidence to the district attorney, the room went silent. The DA reviewed the messages, the searches, the notes, and the photos with the kind of focus that comes from knowing you're holding a case that can't be lost. She looked up at Callahan and said this was more than enough for a grand jury indictment. This was enough to pursue charges as an adult. This was enough to put Madison Harper away for the rest of her life. Callahan nodded. He felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Just a heavy, sinking certainty that a 15-year-old girl had destroyed her own future and taken 2 innocent lives in the process. And she had done it all with a smile, with planning, with arrogance. And now, finally, the evidence that she had left behind in her own handwriting and her own words was going to bring her down. The prosecution knew that proving Madison Harper had committed murder was only half the battle. The other half was helping a jury understand how a 15-year-old girl could plan and execute the deliberate poisoning of her own parents without remorse. To answer that question, they brought in Dr. Elena Marsh, a forensic psychologist with over 2 decades of experience evaluating juvenile offenders. Dr. Marsh had assessed hundreds of young defendants, from impulsive acts of violence to calculated crimes that defied easy explanation. But even she found Madison Harper to be an unsettling case. After 3 interviews conducted in a secure juvenile facility, Dr. Marsh compiled a psychological profile that would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's strategy. It was a portrait of narcissism, entitlement, and emotional detachment so profound that it bordered on something clinically dangerous. Doctor? Marsh's first meeting with Madison took place in a small, windowless room with a table, 2 chairs, and a camera mounted in the corner. Madison entered without hesitation. She sat down, folded her hands on the table, and waited. Dr. Marsh introduced herself and explained that the evaluation was part of the legal process. Madison nodded as if she understood perfectly. She made eye contact. She smiled politely. She answered questions with clarity and composure. But as the conversation deepened, Dr. Marsh began to notice something troubling. Madison showed no signs of anxiety, no guilt, no sadness. When asked how she felt about her parents' deaths, Madison paused, tilted her head slightly, and said she felt bad that it had happened. Not that she felt bad for them, Not that she missed them, just that it was unfortunate. And the language was detached, clinical, empty. Dr. Marsh asked Madison to describe her relationship with her parents. Madison said they were fine, normal. She said they provided for her and that she appreciated that. But when pressed about emotional connection, Madison struggled to offer specifics. She couldn't recall a meaningful conversation. She couldn't describe a moment of closeness. She said her parents cared about her, but it felt like she was reciting a fact rather than expressing a feeling. Dr. Marsh asked if Madison had ever felt loved by them. Madison thought for a moment, then said she supposed so. It was the kind of answer that revealed more in its emptiness than any confession could. This was a girl who had lived in the same house as two people for 15 years and had never formed a bond. Or worse, I had formed one and felt nothing when it was severed. When Dr. Marsh shifted the conversation toward the night of the deaths, Madison's demeanor didn't change. She recounted the evening with the same calm precision she had used with the police. She described making dinner, serving the drinks, watching her parents get sick. Dr. Marsh asked how that had felt. Madison said it had been stressful. She said she didn't know what was happening and that she had been scared. But her tone didn't match her words. There was no tremor in her voice, no hesitation, no visible distress. Dr. Marsh asked if Madison had cried that night. Madison said no. Dr. Marsh asked if she had cried at all since losing her parents. Madison said she hadn't. She said she didn't really cry, that it wasn't something she did. It was a statement delivered without shame or self-awareness, as if the absence of grief were simply a personality trait. Dr. Marsh asked Madison if she understood why people might find her behavior unusual. Madison said she guessed so. She said people expected her to be more upset, but she explained that she processed things differently than other people. She said she was logical, that emotions didn't control her the way they controlled others. She said it with a faint trace of pride, as if her inability to feel was a strength rather than a deficit. Dr. Marsh made a note. This wasn't shock. This wasn't trauma. This was something deeper, something structural. Madison wasn't suppressing emotion. She simply didn't have it. Or if she did, it was so shallow and self-focused that it didn't extend beyond her own needs and desires. And it was a hallmark of narcissistic personality traits, and in someone so young, it was alarming. The second interview focused on Madison's view of herself. Dr. Marsh asked her how she would describe her own personality. Madison said she was intelligent, independent, mature for her age. She said other people didn't always understand her because she thought differently. She said she saw things more clearly than most people. Dr. Marsh asked if Madison thought she was smarter than her peers. Madison didn't hesitate. She said yes. She said most kids her age were obsessed with trivial things and didn't think about the future. She said she had always been more aware, more capable. Dr. Marsh asked if Madison thought she was smarter than adults. Madison paused, then smiled slightly. She said some of them. And it was a moment that crystallized everything. Madison saw herself as superior, special, above the rules that governed ordinary people. Dr. Marsh asked Madison if she had ever felt bad about anything she had done. Madison thought for a moment, then said not really. She said she tried to make good decisions and that she didn't see the point in feeling guilty if you believed you were doing the right thing. Dr. Marsh asked what Madison considered the right thing. Madison said, whatever gave you the most freedom, whatever allowed you to live the life you wanted without interference. It was a chilling statement, moral reasoning reduced to self-interest, no empathy, no consideration for others. Just a cold, transactional view of the world where other people existed only as obstacles or tools. Doctor. Marsh asked if Madison thought her parents had been obstacles. Madison's expression didn't change. She said she didn't want to answer that. In her final evaluation session, Dr. Marsh asked Madison directly if she had poisoned her parents. Madison leaned back in her chair and said her lawyer had told her not to talk about that. Dr. Marsh said that was fine, but asked instead how Madison thought someone who did something like that might feel afterward. Madison considered the question with unsettling seriousness. She said she supposed it would depend on the person. She said if someone felt trapped and saw no other way out, they might feel relieved. She said they might not feel guilty because they would see it as self-preservation. Dr. Marsh asked if Madison believed self-preservation justified hurting others. Madison shrugged. She said everything was relative, that morality was subjective, that people did what they had to do. And then she smiled again, that same small, controlled smile that had become her signature. Dr. Marsh's final report was 23 pages long. It detailed Madison's lack of emotional reciprocity, her inflated sense of self-worth, her inability to form genuine attachments, and her transactional view of relationships. It described her as exhibiting significant narcissistic traits with marked emotional detachment. It noted that while she was intelligent and articulate, she lacked the moral framework and empathetic capacity that most people developed naturally. The report concluded that Madison was capable of understanding right from wrong in a legal sense, but that her internal moral compass was fundamentally broken. She didn't feel guilt because she didn't believe she had done anything wrong. She didn't mourn her parents because she had never truly valued them. And she smiled in court because she genuinely believed she was smarter than everyone in the room. Dr. Marsh's final line was stark and unambiguous. This was not a child acting out. This was a dangerous individual who had committed a calculated, premeditated act and felt no remorse. And without intervention, she would be a threat to anyone who stood in her way. The courthouse was packed on the morning of Madison Harper's arraignment. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes pointing toward a gray November sky. Reporters stood on the steps doing live shots, their voices competing with the hum of generators and the murmur of the crowd. People had started gathering before dawn. Some were family friends of the Harpers, clutching photos and handwritten signs that demanded justice. Others were simply curious, drawn by the sensational nature of the case. A 15-year-old girl accused of poisoning her own parents. It was the kind of story that made people stop scrolling, the kind that sparked debates at dinner tables and in office break rooms. And now, finally, the girl at the center of it all was going to face a judge. Inside, the courtroom felt heavier than usual. Every seat was filled. Observers sat shoulder to shoulder, notebooks and phones in hand. Journalists occupied the first 2 rows, pens poised, cameras forbidden, but eyes sharp. The bailiff stood at attention near the doors. their expressions neutral, but their posture tense. This wasn't a routine arraignment. This was theater, tragedy. A spectacle that no one wanted to witness, but no one could turn away from. At the front of the room, the judge's bench loomed, empty for now. The prosecution table was arranged with neat stacks of folders and a laptop already open. The defense table sat quieter, sparser, a single attorney flipping through notes with a furrowed brow. And then the side door opened. Madison Harper was brought in. She entered flanked by two juvenile corrections officers. She wore a gray sweatshirt and dark pants, standard-issue clothing from the detention facility where she had been held since her arrest. Her hair was pulled back in a low ponytail. Her face was clean and calm. She looked younger than 15 in that moment, smaller somehow, but her expression betrayed no fear, no shame. She scanned the room with detached curiosity, her gaze moving over the crowd as if she were watching a movie rather than participating in her own arraignment. When her eyes landed on the prosecution table, she paused. Then she smiled. It was brief, barely noticeable, but it was there. And several people in the gallery saw it. One woman gasped softly. A man in the third row shook his head in disbelief. Madison was seated beside her attorney, a public defender named Stephen Cross, who had been assigned to the case only days earlier. Cross was in his late 40s, experienced but visibly uncomfortable. He leaned toward Madison and whispered something. She nodded without looking at him. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, fingers interlaced, posture straight. She looked composed, controlled, almost serene. It was unnerving. Across the aisle, the lead prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Laura Einem, watched Madison carefully. Einem had prosecuted dozens of homicide cases, but this one felt different. The defendant wasn't hardened or visibly dangerous. She looked like someone's daughter, someone's classmate, someone you'd pass in a grocery store without a second thought. And that made what she had done even more disturbing. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood as Judge Harold Brennan entered. Brennan was in his mid-60s, a man with silver hair and a reputation for fairness tempered with firmness. He had presided over the juvenile division for nearly 20 years. He had seen scared kids, angry kids, broken kids. But when his eyes found Madison Harper sitting calmly at the defense table, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or concern. He took his seat and gestured for everyone else to do the same. The room settled into a tense, expectant silence. Brennan adjusted his glasses, reviewed the file in front of him, and then looked directly at Madison. She looked back. No flinching, no lowering of the eyes. Just steady, unwavering eye contact. Brennan began by addressing the courtroom. He reminded everyone that this was an arraignment, not a trial, that the purpose was to inform the defendant of the charges and enter a plea. He said that decorum was expected and that any outbursts would result in removal. Then he turned to the prosecutor. A D.A. Einem rose and began to read the charges. Her voice was clear and measured, each word deliberate. She said that Madison Harper, a juvenile aged 15, was being charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. So she said the charges stemmed from the deaths of Richard Harper and Angela Harper, who had been poisoned with a restricted industrial substance on the evening of September the 23rd. She said the state alleged that the defendant had obtained the poison introduced it into their food, and observed their suffering without intervening. She said the state would seek to try the defendant as an adult. The room reacted. Whispers rippled through the gallery. A reporter in the front row typed furiously. Judge Brennan raised a hand, and the noise stopped. Inham continued. She listed the evidence, the surveillance footage, the text messages, the search history, the handwritten notes. The vial recovered from the defendant's room. She said the case against Madison Harper was not based on speculation or circumstantial inference. It was based on documentation, on the defendant's own words and actions, on a trail of evidence so clear and deliberate that it left no room for doubt. Inham sat down. The weight of her words hung in the air. Judge Brennan turned to the defense table and asked how the defendant wished to plead. Stephen Cross stood slowly. He said his client entered a plea of not guilty. Judge Brennan noted the plea and moved on to the question of bail. Inham immediately rose and argued that the defendant posed a significant danger to the community. She said Madison Harper had committed a calculated, premeditated double homicide, that she had shown no remorse, that she had demonstrated an alarming lack of empathy and emotional regulation. She said releasing her, even into supervised custody, would be reckless and irresponsible. Cross objected. He said his client was a minor with no prior criminal record, that she had strong ties to the community, that she was entitled to the presumption of innocence. He asked that she be released to a family member or approved guardian with electronic monitoring. Brennan listened to both sides, then made his decision. Bail was denied. Madison Harper would remain in juvenile detention pending trial. Madison's expression didn't change. She simply nodded as if she had expected it all along. And then it happened. As the judge was about to move on to scheduling, Madison leaned toward her attorney and said something. Cross stiffened. He whispered back urgently, shaking his head. But Madison kept talking. Her voice was low, but a few people close enough to the defense table could hear the tone. Light, almost playful. One of the bailiffs stepped closer. Judge Brennan noticed the commotion and stopped mid-sentence. He asked if there was an issue. Cross stood quickly and said, "No, Your Honor." But Madison didn't stop. She let out a quiet laugh. It wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, but in the dead silence of that courtroom, it was deafening. Heads turned, gasps echoed. Judge Brennan's face darkened. He leaned forward and spoke directly to Madison. He said her name, firm, commanding. She looked up at him, still smiling. Brennan's voice was low, but carried weight that silenced every whisper. He told Madison Harper that this courtroom was not a place for entertainment, that 2 people were dead, that their lives mattered, that her behavior was being observed and recorded, that if she could not conduct herself with the seriousness this proceeding demanded, there would be consequences. Madison blinked. The smile faded slightly, but not completely. She nodded once. Brennan held her gaze for a long moment. Then he continued with scheduling. A preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks out. The arraignment was adjourned. Madison was escorted out of the courtroom, still calm, still composed. But as she passed the gallery, she glanced over her shoulder. And someone swore later that she smirked, just for a second, just long enough to remind everyone watching that she didn't think this was real, that she still believed, somehow, that she was going to walk away. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Headlines were already being written. teen smiles during murder arraignment. Girl accused of poisoning parents shows no remorse. The story went viral within hours. Social media exploded with outrage, disbelief, and demands for justice. People who had never heard of Madison Harper now knew her face, her name, and her crime, and everyone was asking the same question. How could someone so young be so cold? How could a child plan and execute something so evil? The answers would come during the trial. But on that November morning, as the courthouse emptied and the cameras packed up, one thing was already clear. Madison Harper had underestimated the system. She had underestimated the judge, and she had underestimated the power of her own arrogance. The smile that she thought made her untouchable had just become the image that would define her, and it would follow her all the way to sentencing. The trial of Madison Harper began on a cold Monday morning in late January. The courtroom had been expanded to accommodate the overflow of media, legal observers, and members of the public who had waited in line for hours just to get a seat. Security was tight. Every bag was searched. Every phone was confiscated. The atmosphere was tense and electric, the kind of charged silence that comes before something monumental. At the prosecution table, Ada Laura Enum sat with her co-counsel and a paralegal, their materials organized into labeled binders stacked neatly beside a laptop. At the defense table, Stephen Cross sat alone with Madison, who wore a navy blue blouse and khaki pants, chosen to make her look as young and sympathetic as possible. Her hair was styled simply. Her face was neutral. She looked like a high school honors student, and that was exactly the problem. Judge Brennan entered, and the room rose as one. He took his seat, surveyed the courtroom with the kind of gravity that comes from presiding over a case that the entire state was watching, and then instructed the bailiff to bring in the jury. 12 men and women filed in slowly, their faces serious, their eyes flicking briefly toward Madison before settling elsewhere. They had been selected carefully, screened for bias, questioned about their ability to judge a teenager accused of murdering her parents. They had all said they could be fair. But fairness in a case like this was a heavy burden. These jurors would be asked to look at a child and decide whether she was a killer. And the evidence they were about to see would make that decision easier than anyone wanted it to be. Enum rose for her opening statement. She didn't waste time with preamble or emotional appeals. She walked the jury through the facts methodically, her tone calm but firm. She told them they would hear testimony from detectives, forensic experts, and toxicologists. She told them they would see surveillance footage, text messages, and search histories. She told them they would hear recordings of interviews where Madison showed no grief, no remorse, no humanity. And she told them that by the end of this trial, they would have no doubt that Madison Harper had planned and executed the murder of her parents with cold, calculated precision. Enum returned to her seat. The jury sat in silence, absorbing the weight of what was to come. Then it was the defense's turn. Cross stood and did his best. He asked the jury to remember that Madison was a child, that children make mistakes, and that trauma and mental health struggles can manifest in confusing ways. But his words felt thin, hollow, because the evidence was about to speak louder than any argument he could make. The prosecution's case unfolded like a master class in forensic storytelling. The first witness was Detective Ray Callahan. He walked the jury through the investigation from the beginning. He described the scene at the Harper home, the untouched dinner, the 2 bodies removed by paramedics, the daughter who never cried. He explained how the toxicology reports had revealed methomyl poisoning and how that had triggered a deeper investigation. He showed the jury photos of the kitchen, the dining table, the 3 glasses. He pointed out which glass had been Madison's, the one that was clean, the one that had no poison. The jury leaned forward. They studied the images. They took notes. Callahan's testimony was clear and unshakable. Cross tried to poke holes during cross-examination, suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial, that other explanations were possible. But Callahan didn't waver. He had the facts. And facts don't bend. Next came the forensic toxicologist, Dr. Alan Rieger. He explained methomyl in terms the jury could understand. He described how it worked, how it attacked the nervous system, how it caused respiratory collapse and organ failure. He showed charts and graphs illustrating the lethal dosage and the timeline of symptoms. He testified that both Richard and Angela Harper had ingested enough methomyl to kill them within hours. He said there was no possibility of accidental exposure. The amounts were too precise, the delivery too targeted. Someone had measured it, someone had planned it, and someone had served it directly to the victims. The jury listened in silence. A woman in the second row covered her mouth. A man in the back row closed his eyes. This wasn't abstract anymore. This was real. 2 people had suffered and died, and the science proved it. The hardware store manager took the stand next and confirmed the sale of methomyl on the date listed on the receipt found in the Harper home. He said the transaction had been cash only, no ID required for the quantity purchased. Then the employee who had processed the sale testified. He described the hooded figure who had come in, asked for the pesticide, and paid without hesitation. He said he thought it was a young person, possibly a girl, but he couldn't be certain because of the hood. Then the prosecution played the surveillance footage. The courtroom watched in silence as the hooded figure moved through the aisles, selected the poison, paid, and left. INM paused the video and displayed a side-by-side comparison. On one screen, the figure from the hardware store. On the other, footage of Madison walking through her high school hallway. The gait was identical. The posture matched. The stride length was the same. A forensic gait analyst confirmed it on the stand. The figure in the video was Madison Harper. Then came the digital evidence. A forensic analyst from the State Crime Lab took the jury through Madison's phone, step by step. The text messages were displayed on a large screen for everyone to see. I won't have to deal with them much longer. Freedom is closer than I thought. The jury read them in silence. Some shook their heads. Others looked toward Madison, searching for a reaction. She gave them nothing. Her face remained blank. The analyst continued. He showed the search history. Undetectable poisons. Methomyl toxicity in humans. Can a minor be tried as an adult for murder? Each search was time-stamped, each one built on the last. This wasn't curiosity. This was research, preparation, intent. The analyst showed the note titled Plan, and the courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath as the bullet points appeared on the screen. Acquire substance, test dosage, serve without suspicion, act confused, cry if needed. The jury stared at the screen. Some took notes furiously. Others just sat, stunned. One juror wiped at his eyes, another clenched her jaw. This was no longer a question of whether Madison had done it. This was her own confession, written in her own words, saved on her own phone. The defense had no rebuttal. Cross stood during cross-examination and tried to suggest that the notes could have been fiction, creative writing, a dark hypothetical. But the analyst pointed out that the note was created weeks before the murders and that every step outlined in it had been executed exactly as written. Fiction didn't line up with reality that precisely. Fantasy didn't result in 2 dead bodies. Cross sat down. The damage was done. The evidence was overwhelming, and Madison, sitting at the defense table, still showed nothing. No panic, no shame. Just that same eerie calm. The final piece of evidence was the vial. It was presented in a clear evidence bag, small and unremarkable, but the residue inside had tested positive for methomyl. It had been found in Madison's desk drawer, hidden beneath magazines. The forensic chemist who had analyzed it testified that the concentration matched the substance found in the victim's bloodstreams. This was the murder weapon, not a knife, not a gun, but a tiny glass container that a 15-year-old girl had purchased, filled, and used to end 2 lives. The chemist held up the vial for the jury to see. It looked so small, so harmless, and that made it even more horrifying, because it proved that murder didn't require rage or violence. It only required intent. And Madison Harper had intent in abundance. By the time the prosecution rested, the courtroom felt drained. The evidence had been relentless. Every piece had built on the last, creating a picture so clear and so damning that there was no room left for doubt. So the defense called only 2 witnesses, a school counselor who said Madison had always been polite, a neighbor who said the family seemed normal. But their testimony felt like whispers in a storm. It couldn't compete with the texts, the searches, the notes, the vial, the science, the timeline. It couldn't undo what the jury had seen and heard. When Cross rested his case, the courtroom went quiet. Judge Brennan called for a recess before closing arguments, and as the jury filed out, several of them glanced back at Madison one last time. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded, her face calm. And in that moment, every person in that room understood. This was not a child who had made a mistake. This was someone who had made a choice. And now, finally, she was going to be held accountable for it. Closing arguments began the following morning. The courtroom was packed again, the air thick with anticipation. A D.A. Laura Inem rose first. She stood before the jury with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing the evidence is on your side. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She walked the jury back through the timeline one final time. She reminded them of the texts, the searches, the notes. She reminded them of the vial, the receipt, the surveillance footage. She reminded them that 2 innocent people had trusted their daughter, and that trust had been betrayed in the most unthinkable way. She told the jury that Madison Harper had not acted out of fear or desperation. She had acted out of entitlement, out of arrogance, out of a belief that her freedom mattered more than her parents' lives. And she asked the jury to hold her accountable, to see her for what she was. Not a victim, not a child who didn't understand, but a calculating killer who knew exactly what she was doing. Stephen Cross delivered his closing with visible strain. He asked the jury to consider Madison's age. He said that 15-year-olds don't have fully developed brains, that impulse control and long-term thinking are still forming at that age. He suggested that Madison might have been suffering from undiagnosed mental health issues, that her lack of emotion could be a symptom rather than a character flaw. He said that while the evidence was troubling, it didn't necessarily prove intent in the way the law required. He asked for compassion, for understanding, for mercy. But even as he spoke, his words felt like they were hitting a wall, and the jury had seen too much. They had read Madison's own words. They had watched her plan unfold step by step, and no amount of pleading could erase that. When Cross sat down, the courtroom was silent. The jury was dismissed to deliberate, and everyone waited. The deliberation took less than 6 hours. When the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict, the courtroom filled again within minutes. Madison was brought in, flanked by guards, her expression as unreadable as ever. She sat beside Cross, who looked exhausted and defeated. The jury filed in, their faces somber. Judge Brennan asked if they had reached a unanimous decision. The foreperson, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and steady eyes, stood and said they had. Brennan asked the defendant to rise. Madison stood slowly. Cross stood beside her, and the room held its breath. The foreperson read the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder of Richard Harper, the jury found the defendant guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of Angela Harper, the jury found the defendant guilty. The words echoed, "Guilty, guilty." And for the first time since the trial began, something shifted in Madison's face. It wasn't grief, it wasn't fear, it was something closer to disbelief. Her eyes widened slightly, her mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. She looked at Cross, then at the jury, then at the judge. The smile was gone. The calm was cracking. For the first time, Madison Harper seemed to realize that this wasn't a game she was winning, that her age wasn't a shield, that her intelligence hadn't saved her. Judge Brennan thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. He dismissed the court. The gallery erupted into quiet murmurs. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Madison was led away by the guards, her steps slower now, her head down. The mask had finally slipped, and everyone had seen what was underneath. Not a misunderstood child, not a victim of circumstance, just a girl who had believed she was untouchable and had finally been proven wrong. But it wasn't over yet. Between the verdict and sentencing, the defense requested a psychological evaluation to be presented as part of the sentencing hearing. They brought in their own expert, a psychologist who argued that Madison exhibited signs of attachment disorder and emotional dysregulation stemming from undiagnosed trauma. And the expert suggested that Madison's lack of empathy was not indicative of inherent evil, but of a developmental failure that could, with intensive therapy, be addressed. It was a last-ditch effort to sway the judge toward leniency, to frame Madison as someone who could be rehabilitated rather than someone who needed to be locked away. The prosecution countered with Dr. Elena Marsh, whose evaluation painted a far darker picture. Dr. Marsh testified again, this time in the context of sentencing, and she did not mince words. Dr. Marsh explained that while trauma could certainly affect emotional development, there was no evidence that Madison had experienced the kind of abuse or neglect that would justify her actions. Her parents had been loving and supportive. Her home had been stable. Her needs had been met. What Madison exhibited was not the result of trauma. It was the result of personality pathology. Dr. Marsh walked the court through Madison's own statements during their interviews. She highlighted Madison's belief that she was smarter than those around her. Her view of her parents as obstacles rather than people. Her complete absence of guilt or remorse. Dr. Marsh said that in all her years of evaluating juvenile offenders, she had rarely seen someone so young display such profound narcissistic traits combined with such chilling emotional detachment. She said Madison was not incapable of understanding right from wrong. She simply didn't care. Judge Brennan allowed Madison to make a statement before sentencing. It was her right. Most defendants took the opportunity to express remorse, to apologize, to ask for mercy. Stephen Cross advised Madison carefully. He told her to keep it short, to speak from the heart, to show the judge that she understood the gravity of what had happened. Madison nodded. She said she understood. But when she stood to speak, something went wrong. She started by saying she was sorry. The words sounded rehearsed, hollow. She said she didn't fully understand why things had happened the way they did. She said she had been confused and overwhelmed. And then she said something that would be quoted in every news article written about the case. She said, "I didn't think it would be this big of a deal." The courtroom reacted instantly. Gasps, murmurs. Someone in the back row stood up and had to be escorted out by a bailiff. Judge Brennan raised his hand for silence, but his face had darkened. Madison kept talking. And she said she had thought people would understand, that she had just wanted to be free, that her parents didn't listen to her and she didn't know what else to do. She said it like she was explaining a math problem, like she was justifying a bad grade. There was no emotion, no recognition of the devastation she had caused, and the more she spoke, the worse it got. Cross tried to interrupt her. He stood and gently touched her arm, urging her to sit down. But Madison pulled away. She turned toward the judge and said she didn't think the sentence should be as harsh as the prosecution was asking for. She said she was still young, that she could change, that she deserved a second chance. Judge Brennan let her finish. He waited until she sat down. The courtroom was silent. Then he removed his glasses and set them on the bench in front of him. He looked at Madison for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he spoke. His voice was calm but carried a weight that made everyone sit up straighter. He said that in over 20 years on the bench, he had seen many young people make terrible mistakes. He had seen kids who acted out of anger, out of pain, out of desperation. He had sentenced them with the hope that they could learn, grow, and become better. But this case, he said, was different. Madison Harper had not acted out of impulse or emotion. She had acted with planning, precision, and complete disregard for human life. She had researched how to end her parents' lives. She had acquired the means to do so. She had carried out the plan without hesitation. And even now, standing before the court after being found guilty, she showed no genuine remorse. Now, Brennan said that Madison's statement had been one of the most disturbing things he had ever heard from a defendant. That her belief that this was not a big deal revealed a fundamental failure to grasp the value of human life. He said that Richard and Angela Harper had deserved better, that they had loved their daughter, provided for her, and trusted her. and that trust had been repaid with poison. He said that Madison's age was a factor he had considered carefully. But he said that age did not erase responsibility. That intelligence combined with a lack of empathy was not a mitigating factor. It was a warning sign. He said that the court's duty was not only to punish, but to protect, and that releasing Madison Harper, even under supervision, would be a failure of that duty. Judge Brennan announced the sentence. Madison Harper was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. She would serve her sentence in a juvenile facility until she turned 18, at which point she would be transferred to an adult correctional institution. The courtroom erupted. Some people clapped, others wept. Madison stood frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide. She turned across, her mouth moving but no sound coming out. He put a hand on her shoulder but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The gavel fell. The sentence was final. Madison Harper, who had smiled her way through an arraignment and laughed in the face of justice, was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. And this time she wasn't smiling. This time the weight of what she had done and what it had cost her was finally sinking in. But it was too late. The judge had spoken, and the law had the final word. The courtroom remained still even after Madison was led away. People sat in their seats as if unsure whether it was truly over, whether the weight they had been carrying for weeks could finally be set down. Judge Brennan stayed at the bench longer than usual, his hands folded in front of him, his gaze fixed on the empty defense table. He had presided over countless sentencings, had delivered justice in cases that ranged from petty theft to violent assault. But this one lingered differently. This was a child who had committed an adult crime with adult calculation, and the sentence he had just handed down would follow her and him for the rest of their lives. He knew there would be criticism. Some would say he had been too harsh. Others would say he hadn't gone far enough. But he had done what the law and his conscience demanded. He had protected the public, and he had held Madison Harper accountable. Before the hearing concluded, Brennan addressed the courtroom one final time. His voice was measured but firm, the kind of tone that commanded attention without needing volume. He acknowledged the pain that this case had caused. He spoke directly to the friends and extended family of Richard and Angela Harper, who had attended every day of the trial. He said he knew that no sentence could bring them back, that no verdict could undo the loss. But he hoped that the outcome provided some measure of closure, some confirmation that their lives had mattered, that their deaths had not been ignored or minimized. He said the court had taken this case seriously from the beginning, and that every effort had been made to ensure fairness and thoroughness. He thanked the jury, the attorneys, and the investigators. Then he stood, and the courtroom rose with him. Court was adjourned. Outside, the media frenzy was immediate. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones thrust toward anyone willing to speak. DA Laura Enem gave a brief statement. She said the verdict and sentence reflected the seriousness of the crime and the calculated nature of Madison Harper's actions. She said the prosecution had been driven by a commitment to justice for Richard and Angela Harper, two people who had deserved to live full lives and who had been robbed of that by someone they loved and trusted. She thanked the jury, the investigators, and the community for their patience and support throughout the trial. she did not take questions. She simply nodded to the cameras and walked back inside. Her job was done. The case was closed. But the story would continue to echo for years. Stephen Cross did not make a statement. He left through a side exit, his face drawn and exhausted. He had known from the beginning that this was a losing battle, but he had fought it anyway because that was his duty. He had tried to humanize Madison, to find some thread of explanation or mitigation that could soften the blow. But the evidence had been insurmountable, and Madison herself had been her own worst enemy. Her lack of remorse, her statements in court, her inability to grasp the enormity of what she had done, all of it had sealed her fate. Cross would go on to represent other clients, other cases, but Madison Harper would be the one he remembered. The one that kept him awake at night wondering if there had been something more he could have said or done. Deep down, he knew the answer. There wasn't. Back at the juvenile detention facility where Madison was being held, the news of her sentence spread quickly. Staff members who had interacted with her during her time there were unsurprised. She had been a model inmate in terms of behavior, polite, quiet, cooperative. But there had always been something off about her. She didn't engage with the other residents. She didn't participate in group therapy or recreational activities unless required. She spent most of her time reading or staring out the window. One counselor had tried to talk to her about her parents, about grief, about healing. Madison had looked at her with blank eyes and said she didn't see the point in talking about things that were already done. The counselor had written in her notes that Madison exhibited significant emotional flatness and appeared disconnected from the reality of her situation. Now that reality had caught up with her, when Madison was brought back to her cell after sentencing, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. For the first time, her composure seemed to falter. Her hands trembled slightly. Her breathing was shallow. One of the guards asked if she needed anything. Madison shook her head. The guard lingered for a moment, then locked the door and walked away. Madison was alone. Truly alone. Her parents were gone. Her freedom was gone. Her future, the one she had imagined where she could live without rules or restrictions, was gone. She had traded it all for a vial of poison and a belief that she was smarter than everyone else. And now she would spend the next 25 years at minimum paying for that belief. The psychological impact of the sentence would take time to fully manifest. In the immediate aftermath, Madison remained largely silent. She ate when food was brought. She followed instructions. She did not cause trouble. But those who observed her closely noted a shift. The confidence was gone. The faint smirk that had once played at the corners of her mouth had vanished. She looked smaller, younger, more fragile. It was as if the reality of life imprisonment had finally broken through the wall of denial she had built around herself. But even that shift felt calculated, as if she were trying on a new persona, the cooperative inmate, the remorseful girl. It was hard to tell where the performance ended and the real person began, or if there was a real person left at all beneath the layers of manipulation and self-preservation. Judge Brennan's decision to sentence Madison as an adult, despite her age, sparked debate across the state and beyond. Legal analysts appeared on news programs to discuss whether the sentence was appropriate. Some argued that 15 was too young for such a harsh penalty, that the brain science supported leniency, that rehabilitation should be the priority. Others countered that the nature of the crime demanded accountability, that premeditation and lack of remorse indicated a level of danger that could not be ignored. Opinion pieces flooded newspapers and websites. On some painted Madison as a victim of her own underdeveloped mind. Others called her a sociopath who had gotten exactly what she deserved. The debate raged on, but it didn't change the outcome. The sentence stood, and Madison Harper would serve it. In the weeks following sentencing, letters began arriving at the courthouse. Some were addressed to Judge Brennan, others to the district attorney's office. Most were expressions of support for the decision. People wrote to say they believed justice had been served, that Richard and Angela Harper's lives had been honored, that the sentence sent a message that even young offenders would be held accountable for their actions. But there were also letters of condemnation. Some called Brennan cruel and heartless. Others accused the prosecution of being overzealous. A few even suggested that Madison had been railroaded by a system that didn't understand mental health or adolescent development. Brennan read some of the letters, then filed them away. He had learned long ago not to let public opinion dictate his decisions. He had done what he believed was right, and he would stand by it. The Harper case became a touchstone in conversations about juvenile justice, mental health, and the limits of empathy. It was studied in law schools, referenced in psychological journals, discussed in ethics courses. Madison Harper's face, her story, and her crime became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked narcissism and the consequences of believing you are above the rules. But beneath all the analysis and debate was a simple, undeniable truth. 2 people had been murdered. A daughter had poisoned her parents, and a judge had made sure she would be held accountable. Authority had taken control. The law had been enforced. And justice, imperfect and painful as it was, had been served. Madison Harper had thought she could outsmart the system. She had thought her age would protect her. She had thought her intelligence made her untouchable. But in the end, none of it mattered. The gavel had fallen, and she would live with the consequences for the rest of her life. The days between the guilty verdict and formal sentencing had been filled with procedural motions, psychological evaluations, and a media circus that showed no signs of slowing. But before Judge Brennan could deliver his final sentence, the verdict itself had to be formally recorded and acknowledged in open court. This was the moment when the jury's decision became official, when Madison Harper's fate shifted from uncertain to inevitable. The courtroom reconvened 2 days after deliberations concluded, and the atmosphere was markedly different from the chaos of the trial. There was a finality in the air now, a sense that the hardest questions had been answered, and all that remained was the formalization of consequences. Madison sat at the defense table wearing the same neutral expression she had worn throughout the trial. But those who looked closely could see the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the table just a little too tightly. Judge Brennan called the court to order and asked the jury foreperson to stand once more. The woman rose slowly, a folded piece of paper in her hand. Brennan asked if the jury had reviewed and confirmed their verdict. She said they had. He asked if the verdict was unanimous. She confirmed that it was. Brennan then asked the clerk to read the verdict into the official record. The clerk stood and unfolded the paper. Her voice was steady, but carried the weight of what she was about to say. She read, "In the matter of the State versus Madison Harper, on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Richard Harper, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty as charged." She paused. The courtroom was silent. Then she continued, "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Angela Harper, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty as charged." The words hung in the air like a final chord in a symphony. Guilty. Guilty. There was no applause, no cheering. Just a collective exhale from a room full of people who had waited weeks to hear those words spoken aloud. Madison's face remained still, but her eyes moved. She looked at the jury, then at the judge, then down at the table in front of her. Stephen Cross placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture meant to be comforting, but one that felt hollow in the face of such a decisive verdict. Behind the defense table, a few members of the Harper extended family held each other. One woman wiped tears from her face with a crumpled tissue. Another man closed his eyes and lowered his head. These were not tears of joy. These were tears of exhausted relief, the kind that comes when a long and painful journey finally reaches its end. Judge Brennan thanked the jury for their service once more. He acknowledged the difficulty of the task they had been given and praised their dedication to reviewing the evidence thoroughly and thoughtfully. He told them that their work had been essential to ensuring that justice was carried out fairly and transparently. He said they were free to speak to the media if they chose, but that they were under no obligation to do so. He reminded them that their identities would be protected and that counseling services were available if they needed support in processing what they had witnessed during the trial. Several jurors nodded. A few looked visibly drained. This had not been an easy case to sit through, and the weight of their decision, no matter how clear the evidence had been, was not something that would lift quickly. Sure, the formal recording of the verdict also triggered a series of automatic legal procedures. Madison's conviction on 2 counts of first-degree murder meant that she was now classified as a violent offender. Her juvenile status complicated things, but the severity of the crime and the decision to try her as an adult meant that the sentencing phase would carry significant consequences. The defense had already filed a motion requesting that the court consider mitigating factors related to Madison's age, mental health, and potential for rehabilitation. The prosecution had countered with a sentencing memorandum that detailed the aggravating factors: premeditation, the vulnerability of the victims, the breach of trust, and the complete absence of remorse. Both sides would have the opportunity to present their arguments at the sentencing hearing. But the verdict itself was no longer in question. Madison Harper was a convicted murderer. As the court session came to a close, Brennan addressed Madison directly. He told her that she had been found guilty by a jury of her peers based on evidence that had been thoroughly examined and tested. He said that she would have the opportunity to speak at her sentencing hearing and that he would consider all arguments presented by both the defense and the prosecution before making his final decision. He reminded her that she had the right to appeal the verdict and that her attorney would explain that process to her. Madison nodded but said nothing. Her voice, which had been so steady and controlled during the trial, seemed to have deserted her now. She stood when instructed, allowed herself to be handcuffed, and was led out of the courtroom by 2 corrections officers. This time there was no backward glance, no smirk, no defiance, just a girl walking toward a future she had never imagined. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was swift and vocal. Supporters of the Harper family gathered on the steps, some holding photos of Richard and Angela, others carrying signs that read, "Justice for the Harpers" and "Accountability Matters." A few gave brief statements to the press. One woman, a cousin of Angela's, said that the verdict didn't bring Richard and Angela back, but it did prove that their lives had value, that what had been done to them was wrong, that the person responsible would be held accountable. She said the family could finally begin to grieve without the distraction of a trial, that they could start to heal even though the scars would never fully fade. Her voice broke as she spoke, and she stepped away from the microphones to compose herself. The grief was still raw, the loss was still unbearable. But the verdict had given them something they desperately needed: closure. Legal experts weighed in on the verdict almost immediately. Some praised the jury for their careful deliberation and their willingness to hold a juvenile offender accountable for such a heinous crime. Others questioned whether the decision to try Madison as an adult had been appropriate, arguing that it set a troubling precedent for how the justice system treats young offenders. One criminal defense attorney interviewed on a local news program said that while the evidence against Madison had been overwhelming, the long-term implications of sentencing a 15-year-old to life in prison were worth considering. He said that society had to balance accountability with the recognition that adolescent brains are still developing, and that capacity for change and rehabilitation should not be dismissed entirely. But public opinion was largely against that view. Most people felt that Madison's actions had been too calculated, too cold, and too deliberate to be excused by age. The jury's decision also sparked conversations about mental health and personality disorders in young people. Dr. Elena Marsh, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated Madison, was invited to speak on several news programs. She was careful not to discuss Madison's case specifically due to confidentiality rules, but she did speak generally about narcissistic traits and emotional detachment in adolescence. She explained that while most teenagers go through phases of self-centeredness, true narcissistic personality disorder involves a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, lack of empathy, and exploitation of others. She said that when those traits are combined with intelligence and opportunity, the results can be dangerous. She emphasized that not all young people with these traits become violent, but when they do, the consequences can be devastating. Her words resonated with many who had followed the case and were trying to make sense of how someone so young could do something so horrific. Back in the detention facility, Madison was placed in a single cell under observation. Staff were concerned about the risk of self-harm following the verdict, a common protocol for newly convicted inmates facing long sentences. But Madison showed no signs of distress that would indicate such a risk. She ate her meals. She followed the daily routine. She responded when spoken to, but she remained emotionally distant. One psychologist assigned to monitor her noted that Madison seemed to be processing the verdict intellectually rather than emotionally. She understood that she had been found guilty. She understood that she would be sentenced soon. But she didn't seem to feel it. It was as if the reality of what had happened existed in her mind as a fact, but not as something that touched her heart. Because, as the psychologist suspected, Madison Harper's heart had never been fully connected to the world around her, and that disconnection was what had made her capable of murder in the first place. The verdict had been delivered, the jury had spoken, and the legal system had taken the first major step in holding Madison Harper accountable for the deaths of Richard and Angela Harper. But the process was not yet complete. The sentencing hearing still lay ahead, and it would be there, in front of Judge Brennan, that the final chapter of this tragic story would be written. The verdict had established guilt. The sentence would determine the consequences. And everyone involved knew that those consequences would be severe. Madison Harper had been found guilty of murdering her parents, and now, the only question that remained was how much of her life she would spend paying for that crime. The answer would come soon, and when it did, it would be final. The morning of sentencing arrived cold and overcast. A thin layer of frost covered the courthouse steps, and the sky hung low with clouds that promised snow but delivered only a bitter wind. People began lining up outside the building before dawn, bundled in coats and scarves, their breath visible in the early morning air. Some had attended every day of the trial. Others were there for the first time, drawn by the finality of what was about to happen. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment when Madison Harper would learn exactly how much of her life she would spend behind bars. Security was even tighter than usual. Bags were searched twice. Metal detectors beeped constantly. The tension was palpable. This wasn't just another court date. This was the end of a story that had gripped the community for months. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Every seat was taken. Observers sat elbow to elbow, notebooks open, phones silenced. The prosecution table was organized and ready. A DA, Laura Enum, sat with her co-counsel, a stack of sentencing documents in front of her. At the defense table, Stephen Cross sat alone, flipping through notes he had probably read 100 times already. And then Madison was brought in. She wore a gray sweater and dark pants, her hair pulled back neatly. She looked younger than she had during the trial, smaller, more vulnerable, but her face was still a mask, still unreadable. She sat down beside Cross without a word, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She didn't look at the gallery. She didn't look at the judge's empty bench. She just stared straight ahead and waited. Judge Brennan entered precisely at 9 o'clock. The bailiff called for everyone to rise, and the room stood as one. Brennan took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and surveyed the courtroom with the gravity of someone about to deliver one of the most significant sentences of his career. He began by acknowledging the difficulty of the case. He said that sentencing a juvenile for such a serious crime required careful consideration of both the law and the principles of justice. He said he had reviewed all the evidence presented during the trial, all the psychological evaluations, and all the arguments submitted by both the defense and the prosecution. He said he had also considered the victim impact statements that had been submitted by members of the Harper family. And now, he said, it was time to hear final arguments before he announced his decision. Ada Inem rose first. She approached the podium with a folder in hand and spoke with the same calm authority she had maintained throughout the trial. She reminded the court that this was not a crime of passion or impulse. It was a crime of calculation and cruelty. She said that Madison Harper had spent weeks researching how to poison her parents, that she had acquired the means to do so, that she had executed the plan with precision and watched her parents suffer without intervening. Inem said that the evidence showed a complete lack of empathy, a profound sense of entitlement, and a belief that her desires mattered more than her parents' lives. She said that Madison's own words, both in text messages and in her statement to the court, demonstrated that she still did not grasp the enormity of what she had done. She did not ask for mercy. She asked for justice. She asked for a sentence that reflected the severity of the crime and protected society from someone who had proven herself capable of premeditated murder. Inem also read portions of the victim impact statements. One had been written by Angela's sister, Madison's aunt. She described Richard and Angela as kind, loving people who had devoted their lives to providing a good home for their daughter. She said they had never raised their voices in anger. They had never been abusive or neglectful. They had simply set reasonable boundaries and expected respect in return, and for that they had been poisoned and left to die. The aunt said that Madison had not only taken 2 lives, she had destroyed an entire family. She said that holidays would never be the same, that birthdays would be marked by absence rather than celebration, that there was a hole in their lives that could never be filled. She said she hoped the court would impose a sentence that honored Richard and Angela's memory and ensured that Madison could never harm anyone else. Inim's voice remained steady as she read, but the emotion in the words was impossible to ignore. Several people in the gallery wiped their eyes. One man covered his face with his hands. Stephen Cross stood next. His approach was more subdued. He acknowledged the tragedy of what had happened and the pain the Harper family had endured. But he asked the court to remember that Madison was still a child. He cited studies on adolescent brain development, emphasizing that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and decision-making, is not fully developed until the mid-20s. He argued that Madison's actions, while inexcusable, were influenced by an immature brain and undiagnosed psychological issues. He said that she had shown no signs of violent behavior prior to this incident, that there had been no warning signs that anyone could have acted on. He said that sentencing her to life in prison would be tantamount to giving up on her entirely, that it would deny her any chance at rehabilitation or redemption. He asked the court to consider a sentence that balanced accountability with the possibility of change. He asked for mercy. Cross also requested that Madison be allowed to make a final statement. Judge Brennan paused, then nodded. He looked at Madison and asked if she wished to speak. She stood slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. She said she knew that nothing she could say would bring her parents back. She said she understood that people were angry and that they had a right to be. She said she had made a terrible mistake and that she would have to live with it for the rest of her life. She said she was sorry. The words sounded rehearsed again, hollow. There was no tremor in her voice, no tears, no visible emotion. She continued, saying that she hoped one day she could prove that she was more than the worst thing she had ever done, that she could become someone better, someone who contributed to society instead of taking from it. She said she knew it would take time, but she asked for the chance. Then she sat down. Judge Brennan let the silence settle. He looked at Madison for a long moment. Then he began to speak. His voice was calm but carried an undeniable weight. He said that sentencing was one of the most difficult responsibilities a judge could have, especially in cases involving juveniles. He said he had spent considerable time reviewing everything related to this case, the evidence, the testimony, the psychological evaluations, the arguments from both sides. He said he had also spent time reflecting on the purpose of sentencing, whether it was purely punitive or whether it also served rehabilitative and protective functions. He said that in this case, all three considerations were relevant. Madison Harper had committed a crime that demanded accountability, but she was also young, which required consideration of her potential for change. And most importantly, the public had a right to be protected from individuals who posed a danger. Brennan said that what troubled him most about this case was not just the crime itself, but Madison's response to it. He said that throughout the trial, and even in her statement moments ago, she had shown a persistent inability to take full responsibility for her actions, that her apologies felt performative rather than genuine, that her lack of emotional depth suggested a fundamental disconnect from the reality of what she had done. He said that Richard and Angela Harper had not deserved to die, that they had been good parents who had set reasonable expectations and loved their daughter, and that their trust had been betrayed in the most unthinkable way. He said that Madison had not acted out of fear or desperation. She had acted out of selfishness, out of a belief that her freedom mattered more than their lives. And that belief, he said, was what made her dangerous. Brennan then announced his sentence. He said that Madison Harper would be sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. She would serve her initial sentence in a juvenile facility until she reached the age of 18, at which point she would be transferred to an adult correctional institution. He said that during her incarceration, she would be required to participate in psychological counseling and educational programs. He said that if, after 25 years, she could demonstrate genuine remorse, substantial personal growth, and no longer posed a danger to society, she could petition for parole. But he made it clear that parole was not guaranteed, that it would require proof of transformation, and that the memory of Richard and Angela Harper would always weigh in that decision. The gavel fell. The sentence was final, and Madison Harper's future was no longer her own. The gavel's echo had barely faded when Judge Brennan did something unexpected. Instead of immediately adjourning the court, he set the gavel down and leaned forward. His eyes locked onto Madison Harper with an intensity that made the entire courtroom go still. This was not the procedural voice of a judge wrapping up a sentencing. This was something else, something personal, something that felt like a final reckoning. Stephen Cross glanced at his client nervously. Madison sat frozen, her hands still folded on the table, but her eyes had widened slightly. She had expected the sentence. She had prepared herself for the weight of those words. But she had not expected this. She had not expected the judge to speak directly to her soul, or what was left of it. Brennan's voice was measured but unyielding. He said Madison's name, and the way he said it carried no warmth, no pity, only a stark recognition of who she was and what she had done. He told her that he had presided over thousands of cases in his career, that he had seen people at their worst and at their best, that he had sentenced individuals who had committed terrible acts out of desperation, out of mental illness, out of circumstances beyond their control. He said he had always tried to find some thread of humanity, some reason to believe in the possibility of redemption. But in her case, he said, that thread was almost impossible to find. Not because she was young, not because she lacked intelligence, but because she lacked something far more fundamental. She lacked a conscience. He told Madison that what disturbed him most was not the crime itself, as horrific as it was, but the way she had carried herself throughout the entire process. He said she had smiled in the courtroom when charges were read. She had laughed during her arraignment. She had shown no grief, no remorse, no recognition of the devastation she had caused. He said that even her statement moments ago had felt empty, rehearsed, a performance designed to elicit sympathy rather than an honest reckoning with the enormity of her actions. He said that in all his years on the bench he had rarely encountered someone so young who exhibited such profound emotional emptiness. And that emptiness, he said, was what made her dangerous. Not her age, not her intelligence, her complete inability to value human life beyond her own needs and desires. Brennan told Madison that she had believed she was smarter than everyone else, that her age would protect her, that the system would go easy on her, that she could manipulate her way through this just as she had manipulated her way through life. He said she had underestimated the power of evidence, the dedication of investigators, and the wisdom of a jury. But most of all, she had underestimated the resolve of the court to ensure that justice was served. He said that her arrogance had been her downfall, that her belief in her own superiority had blinded her to the reality that actions have consequences, that no one, no matter how young or how intelligent, is above the law, and that the smirk she had worn so confidently in the early days of this case had been a mask for the emptiness within her. The judge's words cut through the courtroom like a blade. Madison's face, which had remained so carefully neutral for so long, began to crack. Her jaw tightened, her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. Her hands, which had been folded so calmly, began to tremble. Brennan continued. He told her that Richard and Angela Harper had deserved better, that they had been good people who had worked hard, loved deeply, and trusted completely. He said they had provided her with a home, with opportunities, with care, and she had repaid them with poison, with betrayal, with murder. He said that their deaths were not abstract concepts or legal technicalities. They were real, they were final, and they mattered. He said that every day she spent in prison should be a reminder of what she took from them, of the years they would never have, of the moments they would never experience, of the love they would never share. Brennan told Madison that intelligence without empathy is not a gift. It is a weapon. And she had used that weapon to destroy the two people who loved her most. He said that she had spent weeks planning their deaths with the same detachment someone might use to plan a vacation. That she had written notes, conducted research, and executed her plan with chilling precision. He said that level of calculation was not the behavior of a confused child. It was the behavior of someone who had made a conscious choice to value her own freedom over the lives of others. And that choice, he said, revealed the true nature of who she was, not a victim, not a misunderstood teenager, but someone who had chosen cruelty over compassion, who had chosen selfishness over love, who had chosen murder over communication. He told her that she had stood before the court and said that she didn't think it would be this big of a deal. That statement, he said, had been one of the most chilling things he had ever heard from a defendant. It revealed that even after everything, even after the trial, even after the verdict, she still did not grasp the value of human life. She still saw her parents' deaths as an inconvenience to her rather than a tragedy in their own right. He said that lack of understanding was precisely why the sentence had to be severe, not as punishment alone, but as protection, because someone who could plan and execute the murder of their own parents without remorse was someone who could harm anyone who stood in their way. And society had a right to be protected from that danger. Brennan's voice softened slightly, but a weight remained. He told Madison that she would have 25 years to think about what she had done, 25 years to sit with the reality of her choices. He said that if she was truly capable of change, those years would be the most difficult of her life. That genuine remorse was not easy, and that true accountability required confronting the darkest parts of yourself and accepting that you are responsible for the harm you have caused. He said that if she ever wanted the possibility of freedom again, she would have to prove that she had become a different person, not through words, but through sustained, demonstrated transformation. He said the parole board would not be swayed by apologies or performances. They would look for evidence of a fundamental shift in how she understood herself and the world. And that shift, if it ever came, would take years of painful, honest work. He told her that he hoped, for her own sake, that she would one day understand what she had done, that she would feel the weight of it, that she would grieve not just for her own lost future, but for the lives she had taken. He said that hope was slim, given what he had observed, but he said it existed nonetheless because the law allowed for the possibility of redemption even in the darkest cases. He said that possibility was not a gift. It was an opportunity she would have to earn, and whether she ever did would be entirely up to her. But the court's role was done. The sentence had been handed down. Justice had been served. And Richard and Angela Harper, wherever they were, could rest knowing that their deaths had not been ignored, that their daughter had been held accountable, that the system had worked. Brennan leaned back in his chair. The courtroom was utterly silent. Madison sat with her head bowed, her shoulders shaking slightly. Whether it was genuine emotion or simply the weight of the moment finally breaking through, no one could say for certain. But the mask was gone. The arrogance was shattered. The girl who had smiled and laughed her way through an arraignment was now sitting in a courtroom facing a life sentence, and the judge had just dismantled every shred of the false confidence she had built around herself. He had spoken truths she had spent her entire life avoiding. He had held up a mirror and forced her to see what she really was. And in that moment, Madison Harper finally understood that she had lost. Not just her freedom, not just her future, but the illusion that she was special, that she was untouchable, that she was smarter than the system designed to hold people like her accountable. Judge Brennan picked up his gavel one final time. He said that the court stood adjourned. The sound of wood striking wood echoed through the room with a finality that needed no explanation. It was over. Madison Harper was led away by corrections officers, her head still down, her steps uncertain. She did not look back. She did not speak. She simply walked out of the courtroom and into a future that would be defined not by her intelligence or her plans, but by the consequences of her choices. And behind her, the people who had loved Richard and Angela Harper sat quietly, some crying, some simply staring, all of them processing the fact that justice, however painful, had finally been served. The judge had spoken. The sentence had been delivered. And the girl who thought she could get away with murder had learned the hardest lesson of her life. No one is above the law, and arrogance is no match for accountability. The courtroom emptied slowly. People rose from their seats with the kind of heaviness that comes after witnessing something profound and irreversible. Some lingered in the aisles, speaking in hushed tones, their faces marked by exhaustion and relief. Others moved toward the exits in silence, as if words had become inadequate to capture what they had just experienced. The journalists packed up their notebooks and recording devices, already composing headlines in their minds. The bailiffs stood at their posts, watching the crowd disperse with the quiet professionalism of those who had seen countless trials end, but knew this one would be remembered differently. This was not just another case. This was a story that would echo through the community for years. A story of trust betrayed, of lives stolen, and of justice finally delivered. Outside, the November air bit at exposed skin. The sky had darkened, and the first flakes of snow began to fall, drifting slowly to the ground and melting on contact with the pavement. A small group of Harper family members gathered on the courthouse steps, huddled together against the cold. They did not give statements to the press. They did not pose for photographs. They simply stood together, holding one another, their grief visible in the lines of their faces and the slump of their shoulders. One woman clutched a framed photograph of Richard and Angela, taken at a family gathering years earlier. In the photo, they were smiling, arms around each other, unaware that their future would end in such horror. The woman pressed the frame to her chest and closed her eyes. Another family member placed a hand on her back. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Inside the juvenile detention facility where Madison Harper would spend the next few years before being transferred to an adult prison, the staff prepared for her return. Word of the sentencing had already reached them. Life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. It was one of the harshest sentences ever handed down to a juvenile in the state. The facility was accustomed to housing young offenders, most of whom were there for assault, theft, or drug-related crimes. But Madison was different. She was a double murderer, a girl who had poisoned her own parents with the kind of premeditation usually associated with career criminals or hardened adults. The other residents knew who she was. They had seen her on the news. And when she returned from court that afternoon, the whispers would start again. But Madison had learned to ignore whispers. She had learned to ignore a lot of things. When Madison was brought back to the facility, she was escorted directly to her cell. The corrections officers were professional but distant. They had read the case files. They knew what she had done. And while their job was to maintain order and ensure safety, not to pass judgment, it was impossible not to feel some measure of discomfort around her. Madison walked with her head down, her hands cuffed in front of her, her steps slow and uncertain. She did not speak. She did not resist. She simply followed instructions and allowed herself to be led through the secure corridors to the small room that would be her home for the foreseeable future. The door closed behind her with a metallic clang. The lock turned, and she was alone. Madison sat on the edge of the narrow bed and stared at the wall. The cell was sparse, a bed bolted to the floor, a small desk, a metal toilet and sink, a single barred window that looked out onto a gray courtyard where nothing grew. There were no posters, no personal items, no reminders of the life she had once lived. Everything that had defined her before, her room, her belongings, her routines, was gone. And in its place was this: concrete and steel and silence. She had spent months in this facility already, but the weight of the sentence made it feel different now. Before, there had been uncertainty, the possibility, however slim, that things might go differently, that her age might be enough, that the jury might have doubt. But now there was no uncertainty, no possibility, just the cold, the unchangeable reality that she would spend the next 25 years behind bars. Minimum. For the first time since her arrest, Madison allowed herself to feel something close to despair. It wasn't remorse, not in the way most people would understand it. She still didn't feel the deep, wrenching grief that comes from truly understanding the pain you've caused another person. She still didn't fully grasp that her parents had been human beings with their own hopes, dreams, and right to exist. But she did feel the loss of her own future. The life she had imagined, the freedom she had craved, the autonomy she had been willing to kill for, all of it was gone, and it was her own fault. That realization, selfish as it was, settled over her like a weight she couldn't lift. She lay down on the bed, curled onto her side, and closed her eyes. She didn't cry. She had never been able to cry. But she lay there in the silence, and for the first time she understood that she had lost. In the days following the sentencing, the media coverage reached its peak and then began to fade. The story had dominated local news for weeks, but now that the verdict and sentence had been delivered, there was less to report. The case would be studied, referenced, and discussed for years, but the immediate public fascination began to wane. Life moved on. Other stories took over the news cycle, other tragedies, other trials, other lives interrupted by violence. But for those who had been directly touched by the case, the Harper family, the investigators, the attorneys, the jurors, the story did not end with the sentencing. It would linger. It would resurface in quiet moments. It would shape how they saw the world and the people in it. Detective Ray Callahan returned to his desk at the police station and filed the final paperwork on the Harper case. He closed the thick folder and placed it in the archive cabinet, with a sense of finality that felt both satisfying and hollow. He had done his job. He had gathered the evidence. He had built the case. He had helped ensure that justice was served. But he couldn't shake the image of Madison Harper sitting in that courtroom, emotionless and detached, as her life was taken away from her. He had seen a lot of criminals in his career, people who had done terrible things. But Madison was different. She was young, intelligent, and completely devoid of the empathy that made people human. It was a combination that chilled him. And he knew he would carry that chill with him for a long time. Ada Laura Enem closed her files on the Harper case and moved on to the next trial on her docket. She was a professional. She had learned long ago not to let individual cases consume her. But this one stayed with her. Not because it had been difficult to prosecute, the evidence had been overwhelming, but because it had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. That evil didn't always look like a monster, that it could wear the face of a teenager, that intelligence and planning could be used not to build, but to destroy. She had proven Madison Harper's guilt beyond any doubt. She had secured a conviction and a sentence that protected the public. But she took no joy in it, only a quiet, somber acknowledgment that justice, while necessary, it could not undo the harm that had been done. Richard and Angela Harper were still gone, and nothing would ever bring them back. The Harper family tried to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of the trial. It was not easy. Holidays were painful. Birthdays were reminders of absence. The house where Richard and Angela had lived was sold. No one in the family could bear to enter it again. The belongings were sorted, donated, or discarded. Photographs were kept. Memories were preserved. But the wound remained open. Some family members attended grief counseling. Others leaned on faith or community. A few struggled in silence, unable to articulate the depth of their loss. But they all carried the same truth, that two good people had been taken from them by someone they had loved and trusted. And that betrayal, perhaps even more than the deaths themselves, was what hurt the most. Years would pass. Madison Harper would serve her time in facilities designed to confine, rehabilitate, and hopefully transform. Whether she would ever truly change remained an open question. Whether she would ever feel genuine remorse or simply learn to perform it convincingly enough to one day be released was something only time would tell. The parole board, 25 years in the future, would have the difficult task of determining whether she had become someone different, someone safe, someone capable of living in society without posing a danger. It was a decision no one envied, because Madison Harper had proven that age was not a shield, that intelligence was not innocence, and that the capacity for evil could exist in the most unlikely of people. In the end, the story of Madison Harper was a reminder that justice is not always satisfying. It does not erase pain. It does not resurrect the dead. It does not undo the past. But it does affirm that actions have consequences, that even those who believe themselves untouchable can be held accountable, that the law, imperfect as it is, exists to protect the vulnerable and punish the guilty. Richard and Angela Harper had been failed by the one person who should have loved them most, but they hadn't been failed by the system designed to seek justice on their behalf. The investigators had done their jobs. The prosecutors had presented the truth. The jury had listened and deliberated. The judge had sentenced with wisdom and gravity. And Madison Harper, who had once smiled in the face of authority, he had learned that arrogance is no match for accountability. The smirk was gone, the laughter had faded, and in its place was silence. The kind of silence that follows a verdict, the kind that settles over a life forever altered by choices that can never be taken back. Madison Harper had thought she was smarter than everyone else. She had thought she could plan the perfect crime. She had thought her age would protect her and her intelligence would save her. But she had been wrong. The evidence had spoken. The jury had decided. The judge had ruled. And now, in the quiet of a cell with no future beyond walls and bars and the slow passage of years, Madison Harper finally understood what she had refused to see all along. She thought she'd won. But the law always has the final word. And justice, however long it takes, always finds its way.